This video topic was selected by my patron supporters. If you'd like to become a patron supporter and help select future video topics, please go to patreon.com/TJRTheOriginal. Hello, this is TJR, and welcome to episode 4 of my favorite movies of all time. In case you're wondering what happened to episodes 1 and 3, they were all encapsulated in the previous video entitled My 3 Favorite Movies of All Time. Someday I hope to go back to those first 3 and do a more long-form video like this one. On this episode, I'm going to be taking a look at King Kong from 1933, directed and produced by Merian C. Cooper and Ernest B. Schoedsack, with a screenplay by James Ashmore Creelman and Ruth Rose. I remember when I first saw King Kong. I was a little kid, and it played every year on TV around Thanksgiving time. I think that my mother was a bit worried that it might scare me. So when Kong first appeared on screen, I remember her saying to me, "Doesn't the big monkey look funny?" She also took a moment to describe that Kong was nothing more than an animated doll that was filmed one frame at a time. I should point out that my mother was not, nor has she ever had, any inclination to be a film buff, and she certainly had no real interest in understanding film effects in the way that I soon would. And yet, she knew that Kong was a stop-motion animated figure, and I think she told me these things to demystify the monster so that I wouldn't be scared. She did this out of self-preservation, since she would be the one who would have to deal with me if I was too scared to go to bed afterwards. But Kong didn't scare me. It thrilled me. It thrilled me in a way that I had never experienced before. And growing up, I looked forward to watching it every November when it would get rerun on local television. Like many kids of my generation, I was utterly fascinated by the fact that giant monsters called dinosaurs actually once walked the earth. And King Kong had them in full stop-motion animated glory. Even better though, it had a giant ape monster battling those dinosaurs. Kong battles a T-Rex, a pterodactyl, a giant snake. He also rampages New York City and he tears it apart. And on top of that, there was a romance between a hardened seaman and a beautiful aspiring starlet. Now to be fair, when I first saw King Kong, the romance part meant pretty much nothing to me. But in a few years, as puberty set in, the romance would begin to take an essential place in my psyche.
I think this is awfully exciting. I've never been on a ship before.
Well, I've never been on one with a woman before.
I guess you don't think much of women on ships, do you?
No, they're a nuisance.
Well, I'll try not to be.
You've been on the way already. Bring that ladder aboard!
Peter Jackson, who directed the 2005 remake, once stated that Fay Wray was his first movie star crush, and I have to admit to this also. When you first feel the pangs of puberty and it dawns on you that you might actually like girls, it can be confusing. In many kids, there is this denial phase about attraction that a lot of kids go through. It's something that I went through as well. Jack Driscoll's "I don't like women on ships, but secretly I do" attitude was very relatable to me at that age. As a young boy, I wanted to be the tough-as-nails sailor that was Jack Driscoll. He had a swagger to him that I wished I had had, and he had a cool, confident way of telling a woman he was into her.
Say, I guess I love you.
Why, Jack, you hate women.
Yeah, I know. But you aren't women.
To this day, that line still cracks me up. But mostly, I just wanted to rescue Fay Wray from King Kong. She was my first silver screen crush. As an adult, I view the same romance as very corny. Still, though, there is just something about the movies boy meets girl, boy loses girl to giant ape, boy rescues girl from giant ape mentality that I still find endearing. And until the original Star Wars premiered in 1977, I don't think I could have found a more perfect adventure film. Growing up in the suburbs of the 1970s, back when there was no information network at your fingertips to cross-reference, I always expected that King Kong would have been based on some adventure novel written by someone like Sir Arthur Conan Doyle or a similar author who dabbled in the Lost World genre fiction. So it was surprising to eventually learn that the film was not based on any pre-existing property, that it was created out of whole cloth. King Kong was conceived by filmmaker Merian C. Cooper. Before becoming a filmmaker, Merian C. Cooper was an American aviator, a U.S. Air Force, and Polish Air Force operator. He got a start in movies as part of the Explorers Club, traveling the world and documenting journeys to other lands. He had a reputation for being a daredevil and adventurer, and it's been said that Carl Denham's character is based on Cooper. Initially, Merian C. Cooper hired the then best-selling popular British author Edgar Wallace to write the screenplay and novelization. In doing so, he could then promote the film as based on a novel by Edgar Wallace. Just like the Denham character, for Merian C. Cooper, it was all about the presentation. King Kong special effects, while crude in appearance by today's standards, were cutting edge for their time. The film's stop-motion animation was the brainchild of Willis O'Brien. Willis O'Brien had already pioneered stop-motion animation effects for large-scale cinema 8 years earlier with the silent film epic The Lost World. And leading up to the production of King Kong, O'Brien was already working on what RKO Studios referred to as an out-of-control film entitled Creation. This film, which featured a group of travelers on a lost island with dinosaurs, was never finished. But when Merian C. Cooper saw what special effects footage had been created for the film, he knew immediately how his feature about a giant gorilla could be realized. Stop-motion animation plays prominently in Kong, but so do the film's beautifully detailed matte paintings by painters Harry Hillink, Mario Larinaga, and Byron C. Crabb. If I've mispronounced any of those names, my apologies. Most notably, though, is the creative way that the live-action footage was combined with those matte paintings and the stop-motion animation. Sometimes using rear screen projection, a new technique for the time, with live-action actors in the foreground, and other times by having a tiny screen built into the miniature sets where frame-by-frame shots of the live-action actors could be synchronized with stop-motion animation models. The more specifics I learned regarding how Willis O'Brien and other creative individuals developed and created the effects for King Kong with the limited technology at their disposal in 1933, the more impressed I become with their accomplishments. By the way, the most recent 2 DVD and Blu-ray releases of King Kong include extensive behind-the-scenes featurettes that detail all of this, and I recommend them if you want to take a deeper dive than I can here. Murray Spivak, a Russian-born American and a pioneer in the realm of movie sound effects, engineered the roars of Kong and all other prehistoric inhabitants of Skull Island by cross-mixing the recorded growls of various zoo animals, combined with a mixture of slowing down and speeding up said recordings, and sometimes by running them backwards. Decades later, Star Wars sound engineer Ben Burtt would use similar techniques in the original Star Wars films. As near as I can tell, King Kong is the first movie to use these cross-mixing techniques to give voice to otherworldly and primitive creatures for which no recorded sound exists. One other noticeable groundbreaking element of Kong's production was its original musical score. It actually had one. These days, film score music is a constant and sometimes underrated part of the overall way in which we tell stories in film. But leading up to the production of King Kong, a feature film might, and I repeat, might have an original opening theme, but otherwise, the rest of the film would use pre-recorded music from other sources, if music was even used at all. A good example is 1931's Dracula. The film's opening music is Tchaikovsky's Swan Lake, and aside from the sound of church bells ringing during the closing sequence, the only other scene using music is the theater scene, where Dracula first meets Mina. This music is not there to add drama to the film, but only because it makes sense within the context of where they are. King Kong, however, was the first feature-length musical score written for what was then referred to as a talkie film. The first major Hollywood film to have a thematic score rather than background music, and the first to mark the use of a 46-piece orchestra. But it almost didn't happen. Merian C. Cooper wanted the film to have its own score, but RKO Studios did not want to put up the money. But so insistent was Cooper that he was willing to shell out his own money to have it done. Musical composers the world over can thank the hubris of Merian C. Cooper for helping to normalize the standard of original film scores. In 1931, there was no Oscar Awards category for special effects or technical achievements, so King Kong received no technical accolades, with the exception of one. Sidney Saunders and Fred Jackman received a Special Achievement Award for the development of the translucent acetate cellulose rear screen. In 1933, the art of special effects was still in its infancy, and the technical crew on King Kong were creating and developing special effects techniques that all the major Hollywood studios would use and build on for decades to come. Upon its release, both the reception and box office for Kong was mostly good, and it's not hard to see why. During the Great Depression, movies provided much-needed escapism from the world, and King Kong provided a level of escapism that few other films of the time could match. A year after the movie's release brought about the introduction of the Motion Picture Production Code, and this made future releases of King Kong the target of censorship. Violent scenes involving both Kong and a brontosaurus separately were removed, along with a sequence of Kong undressing Andero and sniffing his fingers. Over the decades, these lost scenes have been thankfully found and re-added to the film. One scene that will probably never be found, though, is the infamous spider pit sequence. Taking place after Kong shakes several of Denham's expedition team off the log and into the canyon below, the scene depicts their demise by various insect-like creatures, including a giant spider, thus the spider pit sequence moniker. This sequence was deleted by the studio itself, however, before the production code. Although historical accounts differ as to why, apparently the scene was included in the movie's initial first screenings before being excised forever. A more comprehensive look into the lost scene is also available on the film's most recent DVD and Blu-ray release, and even features a recreation of the sequence by director Peter Jackson. For being such a straightforward adventure film, it's interesting to note that King Kong has actually been the subject of numerous interpretations. Over the years, I have heard a few of them. Some of the more ridiculous ones include Kong as the male sexual power fantasy, to a not so subtle but definitely hideous statement, warning of the dangers of interracial relationships. And I think the less I say about either of these, the better. One of the more reasonable interpretations is the anti-colonialist interpretation. I don't agree with this particular one, but I can at least understand it. And it goes like this. Kong, not unlike the original African natives, is kidnapped and brought to America in chains and against his will. He may not be forced into manual labor, but he is forced to put on a show for the amusement of white Americans. And while I don't believe this was the filmmaker's intent, I can certainly see how you could interpret the film this way. And this allegory has been given as one reason why audiences find more sympathy for Kong versus his captors. But of course, the most obvious allegorical theme the film has is the one that it actually states numerous times, the theme of Beauty and the Beast. The film opens with what is attributed to as an old Arabian proverb. And the prophet said, "And lo, the beast looked upon the face of beauty, and it stayed its hand from killing, and from that day it was as one dead." This old Arabian proverb was created by Merian Cooper, and again, his "it's all about the presentation" influence is very prominent. By opening the movie with this title, we all believe that the legend of Kong is steeped in history and myth, and I know I did when I was a kid. Denham's character restates this theme when talking to the press, and then of course, there's that closing line that is not altogether incorrect.
Well, Denham, the airplane's got him.
Oh, no. It wasn't the airplanes. It was Beauty killed the beast.
When I was a kid, growing up, watching this film with my brothers and sisters, we used to joke about that closing line. We used to say, "What did she do?" But it is true that Beauty killed the beast. Andero herself may not have done anything directly to kill Kong, but Kong's insatiable need for Andero does. And as a kid, I always thought that when Kong was fighting off the airplanes, he somehow thought that he was fighting them off to protect her. But in a posthumously published interview, Merian C. Cooper explained his own personal meaning for the film. He actually came up with the film's ending first. The inspiration came while leaving his office in Manhattan. He heard the sound of an airplane motor. He looked up, and as the plane flew close to the tallest building in the city, he imagined if he placed the giant gorilla on top of the tallest building in the world and had him shot down by the most modern of weapons, the armed airplane, he would have a story of the primitive doomed by modern civilization. But interpretation is in the eye of the beholder. Personally, the movie was an extraordinary adventure film filled with scares, thrills, suspense, and romance. But if I were to give the film my own personal interpretation, it would be centered around the theme of unrequited love. Poor Kong. It was never going to work out between him and Ann Darrow, but he just couldn't help himself, because the heart is going to do what the heart is going to do. When you're a teenager, I don't think there is anything more heartbreaking than the feeling of unrequited love, and that's why I felt so much empathy for Kong during my teen years. So yeah, as much as I wanted to be Jack Driscoll growing up, the one I ended up identifying the most with was the monster. Decades later, when the hype for director Peter Jackson's remake of King Kong was in full swing, I had a conversation with a coworker who enjoyed talking movies with me as much as I did with her. She had already expressed her love and appreciation for the Lord of the Rings films, and expressed her excitement to see the new King Kong movie since it was from the same director. She was very young, so I asked her if she had ever seen the original 1933 classic. She said no, which didn't surprise me really. Kong was no longer a yearly television staple after all. But I did know that the original film would soon be remastered and re-released, and that it would premiere on the TCM channel. So I told her a little bit about the original film's iconic place in cinema history, and that she had to see the original before seeing this remake. Assuming that she had probably not yet seen too many vintage movies, if any at all, I made it a point to explain to her that these special effects would probably look very crude to someone who had just finished marveling at the Lord of the Rings films. I explained that movie making and special effects were still in their infancy in 1933, and that the effects artists working on King Kong were, to a certain extent, writing the book on special effects, and that they were as cutting edge to audiences of 1933 as the Lord of the Rings films were to audiences of the mid-2000s. So, she took my advice and watched the TCM broadcast of the newly remastered and uncensored original King Kong. The next day, when I asked her thoughts, she told me she really enjoyed it, that it really surprised her. She really hadn't seen too many older movies, so she had this preconceived notion that it was going to be slow, and she expressed surprise at the film's pacing. I remember her telling me, "It moved fast." This is to me a testament to how well the original film was made. Older movies do sometimes seem slower to audiences of today because many of them were slower in telling their stories than films are now. But Kong moves at a pace that is in keeping with today's modern blockbusters. King Kong may have opened in March of 1933, but I think it's fair to say that it sets the pace for the modern summer blockbusters of today. Then she paused and said to me, "It was so sad, though. They took him from his home, just so they could kill him." I have read that one thing that surprised the studio after Kong's release is that they never expected that audiences would feel sympathy for the film's monster. But they did. Watching the film today, I can see pretty much every single technical trick that was used to make Kong. I can see the hair dance from the animator's hands between shots. I can see the lines separating the miniature rear projection screens. I can see where the matte paintings begin and end. But all the current technological advances in filmmaking don't matter when I watch King Kong, because there is just something primitively magical about how it was made in 1933. And it's no one thing that you can really put your finger on. Some kind of elusive magical storm brewed as this film's various creative and technical personnel came together. And whatever that magic was, it still works. And we still feel sorry for the monster. This is TJR. If you'd like to see me make more videos like this, please become a Patreon supporter. You can also show your support by clicking like, subscribe, smashing the bell notification icon, and sharing these videos on your social media. Everybody, thank you so much for watching. Take care. Bye-bye.